Okay, as promised, I'm back here in part 7 of this series, What Mayor Baba Really Taught. And it would seem that I've gone way out on a tangent. But as I said previously, these videos are more for me than the audience. They're for me to clarify how to explain these things, the order, the things to include, things to exclude, what to emphasize, what not to. And by watching them over a couple of times myself, alone, I think that I will be able to figure those things out. So it's more for me to isolate my idea, the essential elements of my idea, and to isolate the best way to articulate it to a audience that's hearing it for the first time. All right. So this is part 7. Here we go. This one is called "Things That Aren't Real." All right. About 100 years ago, Louis Pasteur came up with a germ theory. And I'll have some links underneath so you can go and read about that. But there's a book about this by Thomas Cowan called the Contagion Myth, and it describes the invention of the germ theory. Now, the germ theory is not just the theory that there are germs. That there are germs is fact. You can see germs. Anybody can. You just take a little water or just anything and put it under a microscope, and you can readily see that there's bacteria. But the germ theory is one that all disease can be explained in terms of some bacteria or other. Okay, and um, this was not obvious at the time, and it is said that on his deathbed, Pasteur doubted it himself. So that's in the book, The Contagion Myth. But now the next thing is much more important. Germs exist. Nobody says they don't. Um, and and penicillin works to kill germs and so forth, and hand sanitizers and everything. But what happened later, after this initial germ theory, is that um, there were some diseases that they could not find a germ. And so they postulated that there were these smaller things that were like germs called viruses. Now, the word virus comes from the Greek or Latin, I can't remember which, that just means poison. Um, but these viruses were in the air, and they were all over the place, and they're anything you touch, and they're on your hands, and they're in your breath, and you're breathing out and in viruses. But they couldn't viruses could not be seen under the microscope. And when they first had this theory, you could see bacteria under a microscope. So they just said, well, these viruses, they're too small. So they're like germs, but they're smaller. But later they invented the electron microscope, and they still couldn't see these viruses. Now, there's a claim that they're too small to be seen with electron microscope, but it's not true. There are things that are even smaller than the declared size of a virus that can be seen in an electron microscope. And they'll point to some things and go, this is a virus today from an electron microscope photo. But those pictures are actually indistinguishable from another thing called exosomes, which is something created by illness, or breaking when cells are breaking apart because of disease. They exude exosomes, and exosomes are sort of these little things that they're I guess they're living parts of cells, or their cells themselves, and they take poisonous material as a thing is breaking down, and they bring it out of the cell. They're kind of cleaning cells, exosomes. And so what some people have said is that what they're calling viruses are actually exosomes, and nobody can dispute that because um, I'm going to get into this. So In 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 2000, I think 19, um, there was a operation called Event 201, and a bunch of billionaires and world leaders met, and they war gamed out a scenario where a virus broke out and went all over the world. And this was sponsored by Bill Gates, who had bought all these, bought a pharmaceutical company, Moderna, and it was all war gamed out how this would spread and how they would get all these vaccines out to everybody, and they would get everybody to take them, and they saved the world in their Event 201. And part of the 201, well, it's all saved. I believe it's either filmed or they have the transcripts of it. They also, part of 201 was repressing and censoring anybody saying there wasn't this virus. Okay? Because they assumed people would be doing that, because crazy people. But what happened is there was a scientist named Andrew Kaufman. And Andrew Kaufman, he actually went to medical school right here in I think South Carolina, and or he had some connection with us. And also he was at Duke. And anyway, he was originally a molecular biologist from MIT before he was a doctor. And he later became a psychiatrist, and he's a psychiatrist today. But to be a psychiatrist, you have to be a medical doctor. And before that, he had his first degree in molecular biology. So he's very good. From MIT, the best school in the world technologically. So he was hearing about this COVID outbreak. And so he assumed it was real, and he decided that he wanted to read about it, and he ordered all the material. He was able to obtain all the journal articles about what happened in Wuhan, the original events, because he wanted to see, learn about the virus, and he wanted to see if they'd isolated it, really found it. And he found that they hadn't, that this was not what they had done. They had just declared it. So I'm not going to try to re-explain that long story, because no one has been able to explain the whole story of what happened with Dr. Kaufman and later Dr. Cowan, and then this later named Stefan Lanka, and then this woman and her husband, the Baileys. And now there's many, many doctors that are on board and see that this is true. What they found out was that no one had ever really seen or isolated this COVID-19. And when they looked more into it, and when they got with this guy, Stefan Lanka, this German virologist, they learned that no virus had ever been seen or isolated. Now, by isolation, that means that you take the thing that's supposedly causing the disease and you pull it, a sample out of a person, let's say, from their saliva or something, and then you just have it, and then you isolate it by then you put it in another person or animal, and then it causes the disease again, and now you know you've isolated the virus itself. But no one ever did that. And it turns out no one's ever done that in history. The virus is only a theory, but the benefit of the virus theory is that you can make vaccines that you can now sell, and there's no real proof that whether you have this virus or not, because it doesn't really exist. Now, there's this test called the PCR test, which is the test they've been giving everybody all over the world. And all this was all prepared ahead of time before this outbreak of COVID. And that test, by the inventor of the test, who won a Nobel Prize for inventing it, is not for diagnosing disease. And it can't diagnose disease. It's a false test. It's basically like random number generator. Elon Musk had the test done 4 times by the same nurse, and twice it found him positive for COVID, and twice it found him negative for COVID. A king in Africa had the certain items tested for COVID-19, including a papaya, and I don't remember the other things. I think a goat. And they all came back positive, including the papaya, which is a kind of fruit, for COVID. And Then the German scientist, they said, we got to do an experiment once and for all because it's never been done. And they raised, I think, $45,000 for who's a real virologist, but he no longer calls himself a virologist because he says there's no such thing as a virus. He did an experiment that absolutely proves that viruses do not exist. And I leave, I'm just going to leave that alone. I could go over it and over it, but I'm not a scientist. It's hard for me to explain these things, but I can link forever on these things. I mean, I've watched probably 100 hours of material by many, many, many doctors. There's no real dispute. There are people that debunk it, but then you have to hear the debunking of the debunking because they're doing word games. They're redefining the word isolate to say, well, yeah, we have isolated it, but they don't really mean that. The word isolation means getting something alone by itself, and you have it there, and they don't. It's almost the opposite, and you have to look into it. It's a lot of words, but in the end, a virus not only doesn't exist, has never been proved, never been perceived, but absolutely cannot logically exist because of the experiment was done so carefully. And they did it like 5 times. I mean, at the same time, they duplicated it, and then everything was written and it's all published. It's even published, which is tough to do because nobody wanted to hear this because there's so much money in these pharmaceuticals for viruses. So the virus doesn't exist. Now, let's talk about a virus because it's very important how this happened. It's in my book, but I don't talk about viruses in my book, my second book, The Evolution of Perception Re-Explained, but it's in there, and I'm pretty careful how I explain it. There's a habit that's as ancient as people. From the very beginnings of primitive man, we looked around at ourselves and we saw phenomena. Remember, phenomena means stuff that you experience. Anything you experience is part of phenomena. And we wanted to explain it. But the easiest first way to explain it was to come up with an occult entity that's magically made it be that way. And so what are those? Gods. That's the first one. Or spirits, or animal spirits, and stuff like that. And then, so, a witch doctor could explain to you that this certain, either spirits or this certain god made the mountains. And so now you have an explanation for the mountains. But you can't really test it because it's invisible. You can't really see the god. And you don't know how the god made the mountains. You just know, the witch doctor told me, and he's an authority. And so this is the same thing that created most of bad science, was inventing occult entities, making them up, giving them a name as explanations for perceived phenomenon. So in order to explain some perceived phenomenon, I make up some unperceived entity. And that's the cause. And I give it a name, and I claim it's the cause. I don't even need to say how it causes it. That's what viruses are. They're an unseen entity. So are lots of things in science. Quantum mechanics is just full of that. That's all it is. It gets more and more interesting the more you smoke dope and make things up. And people are like, I can't believe this. What a world. Yeah, because it's this invisible world of your imagination that you're explaining everything with, and it's not explaining anything. Sadly, this has been where we are. But we're coming out of it, and I want to explain this. These scientists that have realized that there is no such thing as a virus, they're not content to go, oh, there's no such thing as a virus. We have no idea how disease is created. They are seeking for other explanations of the same phenomena of how a group of people, for instance, or family all get sick around the same time. That's a question they have to answer. But they don't answer it by making up a thing, giving it a name. They're looking for processes, all right? Processes. Now, let me explain processes. Throughout history, until very recently, diseases were explained in terms of some occult entity. There are still people who believe in some of these occult entities from early medicine. But And also, um, not just there, but in physics, they had occult entities. But what began to happen in the late 19th century is people started to have a different way to explain phenomena. And instead of coming up with something you can't perceive and just saying that's the cause of it, they come up, they would observe ongoing processes in nature, and then postulate how those could have produced those conditions you're trying to explain. So the best example, I used to have a bunch of examples, but now I'm kind of down to my favorite, and that's plate tectonics. So they used to wonder why do the continents seem to merge back in time into one Pangea, and then they split apart. And if you look at North and South America, and you look at Africa and Asia, they seem to kind of fit together, you know. So now it's believed they did once fit together. But how did that work? Did they float? You know? And so originally this was called, theoretically, it was called um, continental drift. Somehow continents seem to drift apart. But how does that happen? You know? Like one way you would have first have pictures like they're literally floating on the water, but they're not. They're embedded under in the ground, in the earth, under the ocean. So how did they get apart like that? What caused the crack? So it was noticed that in the ocean between the halves there's like a crack at the bottom of the ocean. But they can only see this in the 70s when they had the sonar to be able to do this, and they go over in an airplane, take pictures with sonar, and so they could chart where this crack was. And it turned out that lava was coming up out of this crack, and as more and more lava came out of this crack, the this sort of created more continent as it hit the water and got cold. It created more land, and it spread this way. And on the other side of the Earth, the one plate, they became to be called tectonic plates, was sliding under the other. So you have one that's being produced on one side of the Earth, and on the other side of the Earth, they're pressing together. And like the pressing together of plates is what caused the Himalayas to rise, okay? Because they found um, the fossils of sea life up in the Himalayas. Well, how did that happen? It's because it was down the ocean, but the pressing together of the plates pushed it up. Okay, great theory. No invisible entities, just a process. And the proof of the process is that the process is continuing, and you can go and observe it. So you can measure that the Himalayas are still going up, and you can measure that the plate on that one of the plates is still dividing, splitting apart. And you can see the lava come out, like if you went down the submarine. So plate tectonics is a real big game changer. It's as big, and some people say bigger than that the Earth is going around the sun rather than the sun around the Earth, called the Copernican revolution. It's a revolution in how we think about cause. All right? So then it occurred to me, Baba is saying that this external world that they invented to explain everything doesn't exist. That the physical world and the world of thought, well, we know thoughts don't exist. I mean, you can't. I mean, at least they're not physical. What are they? Well, they're psychogenic. They're produced psychologically, and so is everything else. The perception of everything is produced psychologically through sanskars, and that's what I tried to offer in both my books, which is a contribution to Baba's teaching, is a plausible theory for how it's possible that the whole world could be produced by a psychogenic process. Those last words is everything I've been trying to say. That Baba is really teaching that the world is the result of an evolution of perception, not an evolution of anything, because none of these things exist. And there's people who go around giving talks, and they think they understand Baba's teaching, and they say, well, the world, they still believe in the Big Bang and stuff like that. There's no Big Bang. There's just they think when he talks about the own point, because it has the word point in it, that it refers to the point of the original Big Bang. No, the word point by Baba in the word own point, which I'm not going to go into here. I'm just going to say this here, and I've said it elsewhere. It means a viewpoint, a point of view, a vantage point. Okay, it is not a place in time and space. It is the vantage point of God. So the world is an illusion produced in the mind of God. Now, I'm not saying that's the whole thing, and God is in a delusion and all that. Don't jump to that. Now, how can God be in some, like in me, God is having this illusion, this dream, and he's lost. He doesn't know who he is, and all this. He thinks he's Chris Ott, but he's really God. So that's like an ignorant God. So how does that work? Well, that's not a very good. Not going to please a lot of people. Um, um, what do you call talk of God? Theologically, but that's not what he's saying. To understand how Baba makes all this work, and this is something people really don't know about. I don't know why they don't, but they should. The most important chapter, one of the most important chapters in God Speaks, is the 10 states of God. You know, in Christianity, there are 3 states of God. There's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. In Hinduism, there's also 3 states, another kind of trilogy called Brahma, Vishnu, no, Brahma, Shiva, I can't remember. I'm not okay, but Mahesh. I don't know. But the creator, sustainer, destroyer. But what Baba teaches is that there are 10 states. Now, states, what do we mean by states? Well, the analogy that's used by Christians when they're talking about the 3 states of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, it's kind of like, there's water. It can be steam, it can be liquid, and it can be solid. And they're all H2O. Well, similarly. Now, some people reject that because it's a physical analogy and it's not meant to be literal, but it's giving you what we mean by a state. It's the same thing in a different state. Now, these states that differentiate the 10 states of God are states of consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean that God is consciousness, but God obtains consciousness. And over this process that I'm saying, you'll have to look it up in my books or in God Speaks. You'll see the process. These are states of consciousness. And what we mean, a better way to put that is their ways of seeing. So there are 10 ways. There's 10 ways of seeing that God can be in, and they're in a sequence of 10. And the avatar, or Jesus, is in a state. Okay, and a thief is God in another state of those 10 states, and an animal is God in one of those, and then there's an original state of God, which is sort of not conscious at all. Okay, that's why in Baba, God is not consciousness, but God has the capacity to become conscious. Okay, God is more like an infinite intelligence that is originally unconscious and then gradually awakens and becomes himself at the end of the process, where he realizes his own identity, which is the whole purpose of creation. Well, as you can see, I find that I have to jump around. I don't have to jump around, but I don't have a roadmap. And I haven't wanted one this time because I wanted to tell a lot of things. Now, that's enough on this part. We're at 24 minutes. That's enough on this part 7. And we will now, on the next one, we'll get on with another part of what Baba really taught and discuss that. But I wanted to go over here to open the Overton window to the understanding of what's meant by something doesn't exist at all. The world doesn't really exist. Only God exists. And God is psychogenic, meaning it's like God is a psychological verb. It's not a thing. Things are part of phenomena, and that is produced by the process of evolving sanskars in the mind of God. Now, when I say mind of God, I'm using a lot of liberty because I don't believe God doesn't really have a mind, but it's an ancient. It's a kind of a Renaissance use of words. The world is ideas in the mind of God, they used to say. But we ourselves are ideas in the mind of God, and we are in a sense God having this illusory world experience to obtain self-realization or God-realization, and that's the theme of the world. Baba's subtitle of Baba's book, God Speaks, is the theme and purpose of creation, and the theme and the theme of creation is this evolution that's always going on, and the beginning was the beginning of this process, and the ongoing is the ongoing of that process. And then the goal of the process, which is the purpose of creation, is when each individual obtains self-realization. That's Baba's teaching in a nutshell. But I want to go over a lot of misconceptions, as I've said, and we'll get on with that in part 8. We'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.